G'day everybody, I'm Andy Marks, Chair of the Western Sydney Community Forum, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you this afternoon to the next instalment in our wonderful series of interactive webinars. And today we have a fantastic discussion to walk through with you. They're interactive discussions, so I'll tell you a little bit in a moment about how you can be a part of that. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding this virtual meeting, and acknowledge all of our Aboriginal friends and elders past and present who might be joining in today. And I think I want to really emphasise just how important that sense of place is for us at the moment. And I think that all of us are having a second look at the way we interact with our spaces, given the fact that we're so conscious of them in lockdown. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the topic, and then I'll introduce some of our panellists. Today is really about seeing the experience of COVID and lockdown through that Western Sydney lens, of course, but also how it impacts on communities. And we have some terrific guests to take us through that today and tease out some of the challenges, but also some of the really wonderful things that have occurred during lockdown and what we might see going forward. First, I'd love to welcome Helen O'Loughlin, who's the Social Commissioner with the Greater Sydney Commission. Helen is an absolutely essential voice in a space that is far too often neglected in talk of economic recovery and all of those things that are considered to be vitally important. I actually think that social space that Helen's such a terrific voice for is the most important. So it's great to have her here today. Also would like to welcome Jihad Dib, MP, the member for Lakemba. G'day, Jihad. Wonderful advocate again for our region in Western Sydney. I think you've been at it for around about 5 years now, so you're almost a veteran. And we'll be hearing a little bit more from Jihad too about things at the community level, and we've already shared a few stories which hopefully we'll get to retell to you all today. And last but not least, my wonderful colleague, Professor Sev Ozdowski, who is the Director of Equity and Diversity at my day job, which is with Western Sydney University. Welcome, Sev. And Sev is an incredibly well-respected and well-known scholar and figurehead in this space, which is vitally important at the moment when we're talking about questions of community and equity. So I promised I would do this with you all, and I'll start with you, Helen. You want to talk us a little bit through your experience of lockdown and what we've endured, I guess, in some respects over the last few months. What's it been like for you?
Actually, I have to say, Andy, I have enjoyed it, but I think that's largely because I have a self-sufficient family. One of my members went out to work during the whole period of the lockdown. My older son is 14, so he's quite capable of looking after himself. I did get relegated to the kitchen table and he got the swanky study upstairs, of course. But generally, you know, it was been good. I did really hang out for the Money Heist course series, and even had time to make the mask for Money Heist and had a great time. I talked and I guess communicated with friends in Melbourne, you know, over video quite a bit that I hadn't done in the past. So, and I had a lot of street activity, a great street and a great connection, but I'm in a very dense area, pretty walkable area, and that facilitated that quite a bit. So all in all, it was a pretty good experience, I have to say. Yeah,
look, that sounds interesting. I think I've also been relegated to the kitchen as well. So you take space wherever you can get it at the moment. And I was just saying to the panellists before we went live, and I'll be in trouble if I don't do this promo. My wife places strategically artwork that she's done behind me during Zoom meetings, and she never asks me how they go. In terms of the professional side of it, it's always like, did they see my painting? And I'm like, yes, they did. So big tick for me on that front. Jihad, what have you been up to in the last couple of months? I noticed you kept the office open, which is terrific. You want to talk us through that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Andy. Well, we made the decision to keep the office open. I just think it's so important, especially the community that you know, I'm privileged to serve. With a lot of language backgrounds other than English, you know, just simply directing them to a website's not going to work. And I think those initial days when there was a fair bit of anxiety and panic, it was really important for them to be able to come here. And that was really important. It was I think it's kind of in many ways, it's been able to say to people, look, it's going to be okay. We'll work through this. And that's that real strong connection that I have with the local community. The other thing I was really happy with is just we did an incredible amount of work. We contacted all of the over 70s in the area just to make sure that they were okay. These were in the early days. So that was really great. We made 3,000 phone calls, but with the local community groups working on creating food packs, incredible amount of generosity, and we did some food packs. So that was the work bit, but there is a fun element to it, of course, and so we continue on with the work. But the fun element, for me, the greatest thing that happened with COVID was actually being able to spend some time at home, and it's something that I treasure heaps. And we've got 3 kids of our own. My wife's a teacher, and I'm still a little bit of a teacher at heart. So we did these pretend overseas trips for dinner. So I'm never home for dinner, and we just pretended that we'll go to a different country. And the deal was that one of the kids would cook, another one of the kids would set up the room, and another one would have to do some research. So we still brought some educational value. And so we had Vietnam was terrific. We went to Turkey. The African trip, we couldn't settle on a country, so we made an African safari where we played some things. But we even then, which someone said to me was a bit right, we even did an Aussie theme. So we had the prawn cocktails, and that was really fantastic. But to me, that was what was really special. But yeah, that were the initial, I think, the anxiety days to begin with. We've moved on a bit from there.
I think there's an idea for a television program here, which is around the world with the Debs. I think very, very, very good.
And now we don't have to travel anywhere. That's how I keep telling kids.
That's brilliant. I want to be locked down at your place. Seb, what's it been like for you? I think you are the man about town normally, and your life is full of functions, some of them formal, some otherwise. So I just wonder how you've been managing things in the last few months.
Well, it was a totally unusual time, if I could say so. I discovered it's possible to work from home, and that there are some even pleasant dimensions to it. There is no longer 6 o'clock leaving to drive to Penrith, but you can go to internet 8 o'clock and everything works well. But then you see, I'm also chairing the Australian Multicultural Council. We had weekly meetings of council with the minister to deal with the crisis, yes, how to impact on various multicultural communities so they will come at the other end without any harm. But also the question which stays in my head is the long-term implications of working from home. Can we continue? Or perhaps I think many employers will be thinking, what do we do next? But on personal level, my quality time with my wife improved enormously. We have a time to have a lunch and dinner together and to talk about these things. We never had time to talk about it. And you would be surprised, it's also plenty of learning, but learning through TV, which I never have done before. I started watching a whole range of documentaries dealing with history of Russia, Ireland, Ottoman Empire and other places. So it was really heavy learning time as well, although sometime it lasted till 3 o'clock in the morning.
I think it's been a steep learning curve for all of us in so many ways. And I love the fact that all of the experiences, even among the 3 of you, are so diverse and so rich and so left field in some ways too. That's going to be the real story, I think, of this once the hard part's over, just the range of experiences and learnings. Helen, I'm going to start with you on the question of centering community in our discussions about recovery. It's critically important, of course, we address the public health issues, and I think state and federal governments, for all the criticisms we might label at them, have been pretty effective on the public health front. There's a bit of a crisis to manage at the moment, but I think they've been, you'd suggest, comparatively around the world, pretty good, and certainly that's been the case for Western Sydney. But economic concerns are always front and centre in the narrative politically, and I worry that those crucial social issues aren't getting picked up. And I'll unpack it a bit more with you all in specifics. But Helen, do you want to talk about whether you think social issues are getting enough oxygen and what you might be doing to redress that?
Okay, I think for me, what the pandemic showed us is a bit of a wake-up call almost for us about what makes a city truly resilient. You know, we've just come out of the bushfires, but some of the stuff was, you know, around social cohesion. I think resilience and how you respond and bounce back is often thought of in a range of terms, but not so much social cohesion. And we can see kind of the cities that did less well, fared less well around the world were those that have, I guess, a greater divide between access to good healthcare, affordable housing, a range of issues that meant that there wasn't as much security, and we saw less cohesion as part of that. And I think that's critical. And I think Australia, you're right, we're very lucky. We still have a public health system that is available to people. We actually have, you know, relatively, obviously we have people that are suffering from unemployment, but we have relatively good levels of safety nets. What it did bring to the fore, I think, for people to realise just how quickly on that economic, you can fall out of employment. So that whole debate that had been raging for quite a long time about whether job seeker or its predecessor was adequate was suddenly front and foremost, and people could actually understand that that could happen fairly quickly and fairly overnight. And I think people also appreciated that there were people in perhaps lower paid roles traditionally that we really critically rely on, and that turned up every day for us, whether it be in the health sector, whether it be in the people that were turning up for retail to keep our, you know, supermarkets functioning, or a whole range of factors that I think made us realise how important community is and how important the whole range of occupations in community are. And we need to support adequately and pay correctly those people that are undertaking those tasks for us. So I think that was a clear wake up for us. I think also we actually have those experience working from home, and we know completely different experience. So for me, because I have good digital connection, because I'm in a walkable neighbourhood, it was a reasonable experience. If you were in an overcrowded situation where you were all trying to work or educate from home with young children with poor digital connection or no digital connection, we know 5% of Western Sydney homes don't actually have digital connection, and you're relying on a library that had perhaps closed down, completely different experience to working from home, I think, for some people. And then there would have been others for whom the commute was reduced, and that's kind of things we talked about, hours. So I think the issues are really to understand what's making communities connected, which actually gives that social cohesion, and which reduces some of the anxiety that happens. And we know during the pandemic, what happened is some of those social connectors weren't available to us anymore, and how we adapted was really important. So I think those are some of the key community things for me.
I think they're all good points, and I want to pick up on a couple with Jihad. The bloke next door to me's just started the leaf blower, though. Wouldn't you credit it? Incredible. I'll be sure to thank him later. Jihad,
he could be fixing your backyard. You never know.
Exactly, and I think he's an essential worker. Jihad, I wanted to pick up on that point Helen made around the living situations and circumstances of some families, and we know that there are some families in situations where they don't have internet access, for example, where they're in very overcrowded housing situation, where language and other issues become a barrier. And in keeping your office open, you know, are you connecting in with some of those families that are sort of being left off the digital kind of connection? I'm really concerned about the voices we're not hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Helen, I thought what you said was absolutely spot on. So the group that I often worry about the most are those who I think fall through the cracks. So locally also we had a lot of those who were falling through the cracks. So for example, they were the international students who then weren't eligible for any form of assistance. Say the permanent residents who didn't necessarily qualify for any of the government support. People who really all of a sudden went from having a job, as Helen said, to just being unemployed overnight and had nothing to fall back on. And they're the ones that I worried about. The other group that I was really concerned about that we needed to make sure we stay connected with is, as you said, the digital. I'd like to think I'm a digital native, and I've been educated in Australia, but I still struggle sometimes with websites, and I struggle navigating some websites. So for somebody who either has internet access but doesn't know how to use it properly in terms of the difficulty of it, or the language where they're a little bit unsure, or because everything is just so, it's rigid, you know, you have to tick this box to go to this box and so forth, could become a real problem for people. So I think the access to digital, while it's very good because it means that you can get onto things straight away, people still prefer to speak to a person. People still prefer a face-to-face. People still prefer, if there's a question, that it can be answered, because you can't do that. And sometimes I've seen with some of the service centres that have been established in the call centres, they're not being staffed by people who are traditionally experts in that area. It's somebody who's basically got a script that they've got to work towards. So when you've got a left field question, it's a real problem for. About one thing I'll never forget is about 3 months ago, I was late in the office on a Friday night, and the phone rang. It would have been about 6-ish, and I thought, I'm just going to answer the phone. And I answered the phone, and I was on the phone for ages, and it was somebody who, he's a taxi driver, and the whole taxi industry just collapsed. And his biggest concern was that he was not going to be able to pay the rent. And he was worried that he's going to be evicted, and basically he'd fallen behind in his rent. And so he was not interested in the other stuff. He just needed to go, how do I make sure that my family has got shelter? Where do we need to go to from there? So where we had the timeline of things where it was originally the panic, we've then got to be able to get the information out to people. How do we get that connection to people, let them know where they need to go and protect them? And I'm really worried at the moment because a lot of the eviction notices are coming through right now. And this is like the current problem that we're dealing with. So we originally had, how do I survive? What do I need to do? How do I get toilet paper? To how do I change and adapt my job if I've got one, if I'm lucky enough, to now, hang on a second, this is my day-to-day reality. How do I change my lifestyle and where do I go to the future? The people who fall through the cracks are the ones then who rely on the really good communication. And as good as internet and digital communication is, I just don't believe it's as good as being able to pick up the phone and speak to a person who can deal with the problem straight away. Yeah,
look, I think that's right. And I think also the impost, financially of maintaining a connection to and all the devices and digital literacy issues, of course, are critically important. Sev, I want to talk to you a little bit about the issue of cultural diversity and language barrier in managing some of those issues that both Jihad and Helen have raised, that families are contending with. Are we doing enough with regard to engaging cross-culturally and engaging in a multilingual way? Is that happening to the extent that it should?
Well, there's never enough, but I think we are doing reasonably well. And listening to Jihad, he was talking about a number of individual cases. And I also spoke with plenty of people, and allow me to congratulate the university to put this special system of support for students, especially international, but not only domestic also, who really lost their jobs and who don't have a means of support, and they are really in great difficulty. But going on a bit broader on a societal level, the part of the problem is that whenever you are in crisis, you are looking for somebody to blame for it. And usually the communities which are weaker in the society, which are not part of majority, get the blame and they get the kicks. So there was enormous effort put by both states, governments and state ethnic affairs commission, but also on federal level, to ensure that we do not have some kind of racist bushfires targeting the weakest community. Because when you look at the evidence, Sydney is as multicultural as Melbourne, and to blame some communities in Melbourne for what's happened just ridiculous, especially when you look at a whole range of events in Barossa Valley or in our pubs in New South Wales and so on, which are very much mainstream in terms of connotations. So it was extremely important to ensure that our society stays cohesive and that the energy of us, energy of uncertainty, energy of being concerned of what's going on is not redirected towards the group which are weaker in our community, which could constitute natural, in a way, fall guy to be blamed for what's happening. And it's what we were working on. And I think we are doing reasonably well. The issue was complicated by the fact that the virus came from Wuhan, so the Chinese communities were particularly worried that they could be blamed. But we, I think, managed to keep the level of discussion at civilized level, and also that the long-term social cohesion of Australian society won't be undermined. But allow me to say one more thing. Looking at Melbourne, social housing over there, it's from the 60s, 70s. We really need to look seriously as a public policy matter. How do we provide social housing? We really can't be putting people into kind of housing most of us wouldn't like to live in.
Yeah, look, a great point. It's a good lead into my next question for Helen. I'll just remind everyone too that please send in your questions via the Q&A function, and we'll try and have a little bit of time towards the end of today's session for addressing those, and we'll work through them as they come up, because this discussion includes all of you as well. Helen, just on Seb's point, which I think is a very, very good one about the issue of social housing. I know that falls a lot within your remit, but I wanted you to address that, if you might, about how we might rethink social housing in the context of Melbourne and what we've seen discussed today. But has this really thrown the Commission's timeframes up in the air? I know that in some respects the Commission's about laying out plans and frameworks that take decades to come into fruition, but things have just been moving incredibly fast, and the changes we're talking about now are so accelerated. Do you need to wipe the slate clean and start again on issues like housing?
Look, I think, Andy, that you're right, that the Commission tries to set out plans, you know, for the next kind of 20 and then 40 years. And, you know, that's led to some, you know, big infrastructure commitments. But I think the framework is still right. I mean, I think if you think of anything, that kind of 3 cities, 30-minute, maybe 5-minute local centre is still the right framework. And in fact, it's probably enhanced how important it is to have that more polycentric city where you can get to things that you need to get to. And it's also probably made us look more at localism. You know, there will be some urban, I think we're calling it, localism coming out of this going forward. So yes, there is changes in the way we spatially use the city. And look, at the moment, we're actually out consulting with the community on that. Our first one kicked off last week, and we're going through each of our 5 districts. And we're actually asking the community, what's changed for you in how you use the city? Of what's changed, you know, what would you like to return to normal if you could safely? You know, what's important to retain? What is the new behaviours, new changes that we actually want to capture and get more of? And what are the implications of that? So yes, plans are always living documents, and you always need to respond. And I think the response for us too has been, as we come out to recovery, has said, we really do need to respond quickly, and we need to stimulate our economy quickly, but we also need to think about the long-term public legacy that we're leaving when we do that, about what do we do. So that's underway, and we're talking both with our youth panel, which is made up with some fantastic people from Western Sydney as well as our other districts. We're talking with industry bodies, arts, you know, advanced manufacturing, and the districts, as I said, the councils and the mayors. So we're definitely taking a community read, a broad community read on what's changed and what we need to. And we know the transport usage. How do we kind of reduce that peak demand? You know, the kinds of things that we were seeing about climb and public transport usage, which is fantastic. And obviously the move back from that for safety reasons, but also the problems that we might now have with car usage increasing and wanting to captive the great behavioural changes we've had around active transport and walking and cycling, because of what it does for your public health, your mental, your physical health, but also what it does for sustainability and our carbon emissions. So there's lots of things that we want to capture. In terms of social housing, You know that we've probably put some money forward. We are saying this is the time. We know that the construction industry has great flow-on impacts in terms of multiplier effects to the economy. So there has been some announcements about maintenance, you know, and increasing the maintenance on social housing. But I think there's been a long period of work done on looking at the fact that we need more affordable and social housing. There is a backlog of affordable and social housing. And I think there has been a number of projects put into place. You know, the Communities Plus is how do we redevelop existing social housing, replace what we had, but mix it into greater tenure with a mix of public and private. You get higher quality and you don't get those kind of concentrations of disadvantage. There's been in the Greater Sydney Regional Plan, you know, commitments to targets for affordable housing, and that's been worked through the local housing strategies that have been developed by council and financial viability. But there is definitely a backlog in that area and a need for catch-up. I think what we've been heading towards is probably still correct, which is much more mixed tenure, so that they're in locations that are closer to public transport, that are closer to employment, that are more livable, and that you don't concentrate a lot of disadvantage. And
I think if, in some respects, this will be a way to fast track some of that stuff that was already in train. I wanted to pick up on some of the issues that will be more in Jihad's patch around the experience of schooling for Western Sydney kids at this time. And I know all sorts of innovative methodologies are being adopted. I know with my own kids at home as well, and certainly, well, they're back now, but as of next week. But I think it's been a real experience for all of us in just how incredibly important it is to keep them connected and engaged in school. Jihad, what's that like for communities and families that are experiencing disadvantage? You know, when it's okay for kids who may have that connectivity to be able to do work online and interact, but for families that are struggling, what's it been like?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, firstly, I think kids have proven to be a lot more resilient than we think they are. The effort of teachers basically to just completely turn everything that they've done, you know, almost overnight. And let's not forget that, you know, they finished up before the end of term one. They would have spent most of their holidays preparing this work. Like the whole Zoom thing or Teams, or teachers have never been trained in that before. So some of the teachers would have done it, but never been trained. So enormous shift there. So the digital technology thing. So I think that's, I've got to give a shout out to the teachers, and I always will. I think they're amazing in what they do. And I had the great honor of, you know, of being one. But I also saw what my wife does as a teacher and what she did as a year advisor as well over the past few months. But I think kids have been really resilient. I think part of the forgotten thing, so we talk about the access to technology and whether kids have got, you know, the internet at home. So you can have the internet at home, but if everybody's on the internet at once, it's going to slow it right down. It might be that one person has got the laptop at home, but you might need 4 computers, and not every family has got 4 computers, particularly the ones, you know, who do struggle. So once you get past that, now I know the Department of Education gave out, particularly some of the remote areas, some laptop computers, but I was talking to a friend of mine who works in one of the extremely remote schools. And she said, Jihad, it was really good because they've given us the dongle, you know, the plug-in internet thing. But the problem is that there was no internet service out there. So what their school did is they actually just developed book packs and would drive them around to touch base with the kids. The next one is, my wife and I are both teachers. So we were all right being able to work with our kids. We were able to direct them, to be able to help them, to be able to assist them, to sort of understand the instructions. If I look at my sister, for example, who's not a trained teacher, really wanted to help her kid. It was all good and fun for the first 3 days, but she was pulling her hair out by about day 4, day 5, because, you know, I think it gave a greater respect to what teachers can do. So I think there's the element of access to the technology, but then there's also the other bit in terms of, well, if you're, you know, a struggler in terms of your English speaking context, you're a struggler in terms of your own educational level, you're a struggler in being able to say, well, I'm not sure how I can actually help my child here with their education. That's where it really came out quite clear. And I think what this highlighted more than anything else is the inequity in education. And that's something that we do have to address. You know, we talk about equity. I know Professor Seb leads a lot of discussion about equity. But what does that actually play out in real life? How does that look in real life? Does that simply mean you give every kid a computer? Well, that might help. But if you don't know how to use that computer properly, if you don't have that interconnection with people, then you lose it. The other thing that I think that kids really missed a great deal was the social interaction at school. That was a really big one. Now, I've got a teenage daughter and she really missed her friends. She genuinely, she struggles going to school. But that first day that school was open again, my goodness, she was up and ready to go, 7:30, showered, dressed, ironed, everything that you can imagine. And I thought, oh, wow, it's because she really wants to go to school. But it wasn't. She just really wanted to see her friends, the connection with the teachers. It's that other little community that's so important. And that, especially when you've got disadvantage, is so important because it's what the teacher does who picks up on your special needs that can help you. The one who can say, look, I'll stay with you after school. I'll work with you in lunchtime. It's also the important thing for sometimes, and it's not always the case, but sometimes some of the families who struggle the most, life's pretty tough at home and there's a whole range of things. School might be the one place where they are constantly feeling either good about themselves or they experience a success. So I think there's a huge discussion to be had about equity in education and what equity really means, because my big fear is that disadvantaged communities, something like a pandemic actually worked against them. And that's why I say that they're at school as much as they could be.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think this has thrown up maybe a question about what we actually consider to be an equity issue or an equity imbalance. And I'm going to throw to Seb in a moment on that, about how it might have changed his thinking in that regard, as informed as it is. We're getting some good comments online. Rosemary's raised a point about particular cohorts that are falling under the radar, about injured workers. So those who are already disengaged from the workforce, how this has impacted on them. And I think that's something that we'll address through the course of the discussion, and some other issues on housing density and social housing density, Helen, which I'll return to you on briefly. But Sev, has this situation, I always say that it took a pandemic for governments to treat people on New Start decently, right? And to have a situation where we actually think about those things as a social safety net. But Seb, has this thrown up in the air some assumptions you might have had about equity, about what is an equity issue? Have you changed your thinking on some of these issues?
Well, you're asking a mega question, which possibly will take quite more time to really chew it over and come with a considered response. But allow me to follow on Jihad statement. You see, part how equity is delivered, especially through the schools, is the equity delivered through contacts between children. Because especially in Western Sydney, but also in some other multicultural areas, you have children meeting together and sharing their cultures, and in a way negotiating through different cultures what finally would become an Australian culture. And when schools are closed and children are not meeting together, they are very much confined to monoculture of their home. And I think it's could create some problems, because if you are removed from a society for 3, 4, 5 months, it's quite a long time in the life of a child. So my worry is that if we locked up schools for a long period of times, we are basically removing children from normal Australian society. We are removing them from interaction, conversations with other kids, and it could have some impact. But could I, in a way, reserve my judgment on broader impact? We are still in the middle of it. We are observing various things that are happening. And I would say, yes, there will be certainly some impacts on social cohesion. I really can't put my fingers on whole spectrum at the moment.
No, I think you're right, and it's a good response because we are really experiencing this as we go and interpreting it on the move. And so I think there'll be some very significant learnings that come out over time. Helen, just to return to you, I promised I would on the issue of housing and density. And I don't expect we'll again be throwing out wholesale planning on that issue. And you talked about the importance of housing diversity, but is this the sort of death knell for a CBD and for housing and corporate business density in CBDs? Because Western Sydney's got a few of them. I'm thinking of Liverpool and some emerging sites as well. Is it a retreat to the burbs? What does that do for the Commission's planning? Hang on, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I just had someone come in before, so I muted. Yeah, look, I don't think we'll get a full-scale retreat. I think apartment living and higher density living is one of the choices that will be here and is, you know, is seen in cities all over the world and is part of the attraction of city life and the services that you access. So I don't think we'll get a full-scale retreat. I think there will be issues around some aspects of density, and I think things like the micro apartment, you know, will be interesting if you had to spend your whole time in a micro apartment, you know, with a pull down bed. And I think that you might be looking at, is that really a suitable long-term housing? And it might start to make some questions. I think there will be issues around study space. You know, if there are going to be a proportion, I don't think we'll all work from home all of the time, but if some of us work from home or part of the time, then I think there will be issues around space and study space. I also think that we found that there is multi-generational living, and particularly in our multicultural communities. And I think housing has not been particularly well designed necessarily for that. And that's either means you have overcrowding, or it means that it's hard to find suitable housing stock. And I think housing that's designed with separate entrances, you know, that means you can have an elderly relative living, but part of the family, but with privacy, works for teenage children, you know, gives you options later to rent part, not rent part. I think more flexibility and diversity will be important. There may be some people that can go to regional centres and can work from regional centres effectively. I think there will be people that stay and don't do that long commute anymore and spend more time. But I think it will then be, do we have multi-hubs, you know, where you go and co-work, locate, and you share the costs of some of the working? Will you have maybe smaller office blocks in some of those smaller centres rather than really big office blocks? Quite possibly. Will there need to be redesign so that you maybe have touchless, you know, lifts and issues like that that make them safer in this kind of circumstance? I think those will all come to the fore, but I don't think there'll be a wholesale retreat from apartment living.
And I think you're right. I think there'll be some nuanced changes. I really like the point around intergenerational living. I think that was already perhaps happening, but it may accelerate now. And we're learning so much from the multicultural experience where issues
also,
of care.
You know, the safety and retirement and, you know, obviously some palliative and nursing homes will still be required, but people getting support services and living longer in their homes, you know, and that may change. You might be much happier to do them rather than in congregate situations.
No, I think it's a great point. I think
the
diffusion of services. Seb, before I comment, I'll just let you comment. You look like you want to say something.
Yeah, just one thing. You see, density itself, it's not the key issue. Quite a number of us aspires to be in quite dense populations. If you look at Bangalore and where you have hundreds of apartments and you pay 3-4 million per one, it's a choice. Yeah, the issue is poverty, which is associated with density. And it's where we really need to act to ensure that we don't concentrate poverty in particular density buildings. It's the issue. Yeah, it's not density on its own. It's in association with poverty.
Yeah, so avoiding those concentrations of disadvantage and having policies that support diversity in housing mix. Great point, Seb. And we were trying to do that, I think, but we really need to step on the accelerator now on that and support it much more quickly. Jihad, on the question of how we behave in cities and how we interact with services, and again to go to schools and libraries and public facilities. So are we going to see much more adaptive use of those facilities? I know that the state government's already working towards some use of schools outside of hours and opening up of facilities. What if we had a situation where, you know, through the burbs, through Lakemba, through other areas, we opened up schools out of hours for other uses to allow communities to use space more effectively? Is that possible?
Mate, that sounds like a policy I spoke about once, but
I know, I was cheated a little bit, mate. I'm sorry. I did a bit of research.
No, but it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? You know, these are buildings that by and large are used, you know, for parts of the day. And I'm not going to say they're only used for school hours because they're used a lot more than that. But what do? We fence off a school. So we actually stop the community from using that school facility. Now I'm talking about parks and things. So in Lakemba, for example, you've got a number of schools. Now, each one of those schools has got a really great play space, a play area. Why can't we look at ways that those are being used more often? Why isn't it that that doesn't become a potential place where people can do things? One of the things that worries me is that people who live in my electorate have to go somewhere else for a nice day out. They've got to go outside of the electorate to be able to go and have a family picnic. And that really bothers me, because I think, you know, we should be able to have something that's nice. And that goes back a little bit then to the equity that, you know, you might jump in your car for half an hour so that you could sit in the park because there's a nice little area. There's those things. So I was, look, a big believer in schools as community hubs. Schools are always community hubs. And I've just said that that's the most important role that they can play. And so for me, it was about opening up the school to the community so that there's a sense of ownership for the community. When the community feels like they own the school and they are part of the school, then it also creates a sense of community. And a school can effectively be like a lighthouse within a community. It's the place where you go, where you can use, like, you know, the wood workshop or the kitchens.
And that's the role they used to play, isn't it, Jihad?
That was a really important role. I mean, one of the nicest things that I remember we did that I loved, and you talk about social cohesion, is we used our kitchen to be able to bring together women of, say, Muslim faith, women of Jewish faith, and to come together and to learn to cook. But they were actually doing much more than that. They were learning about one another. We ran programs in the evenings using our woodwork class for dads who just wanted to learn up a bit of the handy skills. For mums, we used the computers to teach basic computer skills. So I think in some ways there's a community college element. But going back to that idea is, you've got a building that you really might not use after 5 o'clock, and yet you lock it all up. And I think there's a lot of space. And it goes back to that sense of community that Helen was talking about. I'd like to see an investment in schools to be used potentially as public spaces. And whilst you might have more and more density, and we're seeing some density in our local area, imagine being the family it's okay to live in a 2-bedroom unit, but imagine if that's where you're locked down in a 2-bedroom unit, you can't get there. You've got to be able to look at green space. So definitely that sense of community spaces, schools play a massive role in that. And I think more importantly, what it does is, I want people to feel like their school is their local community school. And that's come back to that sense of everyone's sense of belonging. So
what if we extended that idea? What if we didn't just think of schools in that way? Maybe schools can be at the vanguard and do it first and do it best. But what, Helen, if we had corporates open up facilities in a similar way? Because we have this situation where not everybody's going to return to the desk. And you may have large-scale corporate buildings. I'm thinking even of the university. We certainly said before lockdown we had hundreds of HSC students in every evening at our campus using our facilities to study. It was fantastic. Barney loved it. I thought it was the best thing ever, because that's what we want to support in the community. But Helen, could the Commission just give some corporates a little bit of a nudge? And Western Sydney's open to being experimented on here. We'll put our hands up to get corporates to open up some more space for some of those uses that, like Jihad's just mentioned. Let's not leave it just to schools. Can others carry the can with the Commission's encouragement?
Look, I think there is the opportunity for a whole. I mean, I think at what happens to libraries as well, how diverse the library has become and how you use the library as well. But yeah, there should be an opportunity for corporates. I mean, there may be issues around leasing and insurance and security and all the kinds of things that probably schools went through at the first issue that would need to be addressed. But there may be a number of corporates with social kind of responsibility, you know, bottom lines as well, that are interested in doing that. And I think the whole way we use space just generally, I know even in commercial leases, you know, you're seeing now to make things stack up in your high street. I can think of where I live. In the morning, there is a coffee place that runs from 5 till, you know, 9 or 5 till 10. That's a completely different business. Then a different business takes over between, you know, 10 and someone else comes in at night time. And that kind of makes it, we're seeing pop-up art galleries, you know, we're seeing fantastic uses. The shops have got a, you know, front window, they just put a board across the back and they start having a pop-up art gallery in there. It helps them, it brings, you know, patronage for them or interest, but it also helps someone have an affordable space to lease and to use. So I do. What do you think?
Sorry, Helen, I was going to ask Seb on that point as well. That's a kind of really spontaneous use of space too by community groups. And Helen and Seb, is that something we can support as we come out of this period where community groups and business can work more together and it not just become an issue for governments to solve?
I think, sorry, Seb, I'll go quickly. I think it's critical that we actually work with industry and with the governments. You know, if I think about the arts facilities, you know, think about all the arts facilities and institutions that unfortunately can't get the patronage levels high enough to make it worth opening at the moment for commercial aspects, but there might be able to be other uses of those that are possible. So I think yes.
No, that's a great point, Helen. What do you think, Seb? Is there more room for industry in the private sector to play a role in equity issues like this?
Of course, there's no question about it, because any activities, for example, dealing with production of arts or dealing with theaters, dealing with cooking together, dealing with sport and so on, require money. And any such activities involve people from a whole range of different communities. It allows them to work together. And it's not an issue of the government to pay for everything we can dream of. It's, I think, room also for local solid citizens running businesses, yes, starting to get involved with especially diverse groups working together.
Can I just jump in there for a sec, Andy, just on that point? I think both are raised it. Like, it's really important that not everything is left to the government. You know, government is good because it's you know, your fallback, and you also know there's the guarantee of government. And I know that sometimes we as politicians get stuck into the trap of saying, you know, the government's got to pay for everything. That might be all right in some sense, but in something like this, which is a community development, the government might just need to be able to give it a little bit of a push along, a little bit of, say, seed funding, or a little bit of cutting the red tape so that it allows it to happen. But by and large, if you get the businesses and the communities, what you're actually going to get is you're going to get a localized solution to maybe either a problem or a need that they want. And nobody knows better than the local community what is specific for them. So maybe in one place, it might be the art gallery, but potentially in Punchbowl, it might be that I've got some issues with some young people and I want to run like a hip hop, you know, dance program or something like that. And I might need a few $100 that maybe the community can't afford, but there's an easy access of funding that I get, but it allows the local community to do it. In so many ways, when you give ownership to people who are going to be running the program, it gives not only a sense of belonging, but they actually do it and you get much better outcomes because they're not necessarily looking at what box do I have to tick to be able to get the funding, but rather what box do I have to tick to be able to meet the outcome that we want, which is ultimately about bringing people together. So I think there's a role for everybody. And what the pandemic has shown us is if we actually all work together, there's amazing creativity, there's amazing goodwill. What we maybe from government perspective do is how do you smooth that out? How do you connect the businesses with the local charities, with the local community, with the people who are stuck at home who have got enormous skills, but they just don't know what to do with them. There's so many people that want to help, but they don't know how to help. And I reckon there's a lot of space there, but I come back to that idea of local solutions will always have so much more of a positive outcome.
Jihad, I didn't know that you had a budding career in hip hop.
Mate, I am actually just on a completely off. My son's a little dancer. He's a hip hopper. He's actually a good dancer. He doesn't get anything from me. I'm really good with the 80s dancing, but hip hop. Apparently, the sprinklers make it a comeback.
Look, I totally get it, mate. I learned how to breakdance, how to moonwalk. I'm an excellent moonwalker at the Blacktown Community Hall in the early 80s.
Yeah, exactly. It's old times, old times.
It's going to come back one day, Seth. Don't worry. Listen, we're in the home stretch, and so I'm going to kind of get us to try and sum up as much as we can. And these things are never over, because the questions that should emerge from these kind of discussions, you know, are ongoing. I always worry when everyone's full of answers and absolute responses. So it's great that we're getting such terrific questions. And thanks again to everybody online for joining in that. Helen, I guess the next 3 months are going to be critical. You know, we've had the sort of really, my heart goes out to people in Victoria, and particularly those in public housing, who are just so courageous. Everyone that's helping them, and the people, of course, impacted themselves, have been incredibly courageous and cohesive, and the community response in the main's been good. There's been a few idiots out there that have kind of, you know, reverted to the old stereotypes, but in the main, the community, business and government, Jihad, just as you said, have all come together just to help these people, which has been great. I'm confident that if we have something like that occur in Western Sydney, that the response will be the same. But how do we make those responses that occur to those incidents become the norm in government and in agencies like the Commission, and, you know, at the state government level, and SEV also through institutions like the university? How do we make that wonderful scrambling to help something that we do, or do we already do it well?
I think when I think about all those stories, are amazing. I mean, the most common one is kind of the local brewers going to hand sanitizer, but there was also the stage production company that suddenly started producing home office furniture because there was a huge call for that. And then I did see those images on TV, those great images of people just driving up in their car with goods and services and saying, we're all in this together. And I think you get that feeling of belonging when you have connected communities, you know, when you share something common. And I think at a bigger level, what's come out of that, I guess, for Australia in terms of attracting economic industry, and particularly for Western Sydney, has been somewhere where they see a multicultural community, quite highly skilled in areas, that has the capacity, I guess, to innovate and move quickly, but also I think they see it as a safe place to invest. You know, they see the democracy working, they see the social cohesion working, and I think that has allowed the attraction of some of those industries and some of those advantages that we're going to see around, you know, advanced manufacturing, where we've got the institutions like Western Sydney University and other universities coming together with industry, with TAFE, with skills, trying to get the pathways for kids going through. And I think that kind of community means if you live in a community where you can see a pathway for you, long-term pathway for you into secure and appropriate employment, if you're in a community that is cohesive enough to let you, you know, practice your faith or talk your language, or I think the responses that we've seen, I know we always get some division, and clearly some people are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, you know, casualised labour, precarious labour, youth, you know, women, people that are at home with poor circumstances or insecure housing, all of those groups. But by and large in Australia, we haven't seen the sort of responses that you've seen perhaps in the States.
No, we haven't seen that division, have we? Anywhere near the extent that we're seeing elsewhere. Yeah.
And that, I think, comes down to how connected you feel in your community. And being connected in your community is not just you as an individual, though that's important network. It's actually the industry and the employers around you and the government response around you. So how do we make it happen on an ongoing basis? I think you have to actually keep instilling how important those social connectors are and social cohesions to building understanding of each other and understanding of a community's needs, I think.
Yeah, look, terrific response. I agree. Sev, what will we take out of this in terms of equity in communities? What would you like to see us take out of it?
Listen, I think what we have is a new normal in terms of social goodwill. I never seen us so unified, including the national cabinet and so on. And I never seen in a long time different community groups coming together and working with each other. The question is, can we really take it for the future? Can we use that new normal as a pattern of behavior we'd like to maintain in the future? And the key challenge will be an economic challenge, because whatever we are saying, the current crisis is undermining economy, and we'll have much larger unemployment. And it will require very clever public policy for the government to ensure that this new goodwill level stays much longer and will help us to deal with the economic difficulties we will be facing in the next 2 years.
I think that's an excellent point. It's the one contagion that we want to catch is goodwill, you know, and that's bubbled up to the surface so amazingly. And you're right, Sev, I think it was always there. It took something like this to bring it out. So excellent point. Jihad, opposition is a hard place to be in at the best of times, particularly when you're so active as you are in coming up with ideas. And the community school stuff is just one of them. And opposition's even harder when there's a crisis on, in some respects, because you have so much to offer and you're not always asked. What's the opposition doing in terms of responding to this crisis? And what do you think, how healthy do you think government is at that state level in terms of its response to crisis?
Yeah, well, it is, opposition is hard, you know, because you go in because you want to make a difference, and you do at a local level, but you know, in government it's a bit easier. I think the role for opposition is really important. You've got to obviously hold the government to account if something goes wrong, but in a situation like a crisis and a pandemic, what you also have to play the role of is supporting, and we see that with the National Cabinet. And that doesn't mean everything gets a green light and it's a pass straight through, but a recognition too that we're in, you know, and you hear the phrase often, we're in unprecedented times. This is not a situation that you knew was going to happen before the election. And my personal belief is if there's anything that I can do, whether I'm in government or in opposition, that's going to help our community, then I'll do that. And I think that's the role of public office. Playing petty politics and point scoring, I don't like that at the best of times. I certainly don't think it's the right thing to do now. But it is difficult when you go, hey, here's a solution that I can put forward to you. Will you run with that solution? When sometimes the simple reason it stops is because you're on the wrong side of the chamber. And I think what we've actually seen through the pandemic, and we see all through the acts of kindness, and everyone has spoken about it, but we're actually seeing the best of people. And where I saw the best of people, where if we went back to some of the stuff that was happening of a racial nature that Sev touched on, what was really good was when somebody wanted to have a crack at someone else because of their cultural background or their religious background, trying to put them down, there was no shortage of people who stood up to defend them. And I thought that to me was so important, that we got rid of that bystander effect. When somebody was in need during this crisis, as they might be now, we're not asking what their faith is or what their cultural background is, how much money. We just say, how can I help?
Yeah.
We've seen, you know, whether it's the Sikh community down in Victoria that put food together, the Muslim community that was doing some stuff here. We're not, I refer to that, but we're not actually seeing them as individual communities. We're seeing this as part of being Australian. So in many ways, what this has done is it actually came down to who we are as individuals, which is, we're all part of that great mosaic. And I've been using this much more often now that, you know, Australia's a jigsaw puzzle of 25 million pieces. And every one of those different pieces, every one of those pieces is different, but they somehow interconnect. And we've got to make sure that we get that connection, because we are a beautiful jigsaw puzzle. We don't want people to change who they are, but we want to know that we're all in some way connected. We're all in some way related, but that we all rely on each other to be connected. And I think that's the really important thing we've seen in this, and in times of crisis, you actually see what people are truly made of. And I think what Australians are at the very heart of it is they're good people. We all want to be good people. I'm not happy because, you know, I haven't got coronavirus for somebody else. I'm relieved that it's not me, but I'm sad for them, and I want to see how it is that I can help them. And when it comes to politics, I think people are, for a long time, people are sick and tired of petty politics, of ridiculous politics where you just say, no, no, no. In opposition, you criticise, but you don't criticise just for the sake of criticising. And in government, you don't get rid of a plan just simply because it's come from opposition. I think people deserve better than that. And that's what people expect. And we are seeing it in this time. I think it's so important. We've got a chance to really move forward beyond this. And I think we capture that goodwill that my fellow panelists have talked about and say, how can we go from being good to even better?
Oh, Jihad, I'm getting emotional. That's great.
You've got to be passionate about it. Otherwise, there's no use doing it.
No, I agree with all of you. And I think we've seen so much goodwill today. And it has been something where we've learnt so much as a region, as a community from what's been happening. But I've learned one of the most important things is that we value kindness and compassion as a society above all else. So, and you've all exemplified that today. So this discussion goes on. We're going to draw it to a close now, of course, but I'd encourage anyone out there, and I want to thank you all for your questions. We didn't get to all of them, but they're all very important. And I want to encourage you to connect with the Community Forum's website or with our LinkedIn site and keep putting those questions forward, and we'll get to them. But I firstly just want to thank the panelists, Jihad, Helen and Sev. Wonderful insights today. And it's always very heartening when our region has leaders of this calibre, because it lets us know that they're a wonderful expression of the very best of what Western Sydney is. So thanks again, everybody. And there'll be more of these. Stay tuned. And Jihad, you've got to stop doing that to me. I've got to get to the tissues now.
Oh, that was the breakdance.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm going to be a comedian one day.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll see
Thanks,
you in the next
Thanks,
one.
Steve. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.